Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. If you're new to this series, which I think I mostly see some veteran names on here, but my name is Taylor Goodwin. I'm the Safe and Healthy Schools Coordinator for the Vermont Agency of Education. I'm joined today by several members of our team from new Solutions K12, who are here to help us just continue to understand more best practices about budgeting. And this session in particular is to really help bolster that understanding and support for budgets. So I will go ahead and turn it over to our friend Nate Levenson and his team.
Great afternoon, everybody. Good to be back with. Seems like a lot of familiar faces. Today, we're going to continue the discussion of, hey, you've designed a really good budget. It makes sense. It balances the needs. I know a lot of school systems get to this place where you feel like in a tough situation, we got the best possible solution, all things considered. And then that's not enough because we know that you got to get the community and the board to approve it. And so we want to continue the discussion about how do you generate the support for these good, thoughtful budgets that you've developed. So we're going to continue with that. This one's really focusing on how do you get the people who you need to show up and say, yep, this is good. It may be hard, but it's good. And this is what we should do. And fortunately, there is a lot of research on this very topic. So let me share my screen and walk you through what the research says, how to get people to support how to get people to support a good budget. And let's see if that's coming. Share my screen, get into presentation mode, just taking a bit. Great, people seeing my screen and I'm in presentation mode. Thank you, Taylor, good. Great. Perfect. I think you know this is a joint effort, New Solutions and the Vermont Agency of Education. Same link. If you've got questions, take a picture. We'll answer it and get back to you. And we'll also be hosting office hours in January. You guys know this. Again, to make this a little bit more interactive, where we're trying to give you some opportunities to share both questions and insight. So using this QR code gets you into our interactive portion of today's discussion. And just the first question I was just hoping to hear from some of you is, where do you typically encounter the most pushback or resistance after you've developed your budget? Is it teachers that we got to win over and explain? Is it principals, parents and families? Is it actually the school board or the community at large? Again, you can see the QR code up front in the upper left-hand corner. Love to get a sense from folks. Where's the pushback? So it looks like we've got 6, 7 people, and it is the community. So it's really outside the school system that you're seeing the biggest pushback, which I think really connects to, now we got 8 votes for community. So I think that's a fairly clear statement from you all. And I think this just harkens back to yesterday's discussion where we talked so much about the importance of taking out jargon and not overloading folks with numbers and having a story to tell. I think that if you look at all the folks, like the teachers and the principals, they're not going to be confused by jargon. They live it and speak it. So I think the fact that the community more broadly is your greatest area of pushback, I think it just reinforces some of the points we made yesterday, and it will connect to the points we're making today. So the first thing we want to talk about is, if you want to win support from the community, we're really suggesting very strongly that we need to win the support of principals, because if you have the sincere and active support of principals, you will then get the support of the community. Now, one of the things that makes Vermont special, and as you know, Vermont is special in many ways, but one way in which Vermont is special is that principals have more clout and more influence in Vermont than in any of the 30 states I've worked in. And I think the reason principals, in some ways, almost feel like mini school superintendents, because your schools are small, your districts are small, you often have one school in each town. The school is very connected to the town. So the principal becomes connected to the town. Even a lot of people think of their town as the school budget. Obviously, it's just part of a district budget. But what we've seen from our work in Vermont is that when and I say this as a former superintendent, if a superintendent said, hey, this is a great idea, and a principal says, nah, I don't really think it is, I think the principal is more likely to be persuasive in the community, more so than the superintendent. And there's a lot of national research, enormous amount of national research that says principals are considered more trustworthy communicators. Principals are more likely to give you the true scoop than a superintendent. Now, I will say, knowing many of the superintendents in Vermont and having been one, I don't think that's a fair rap. I think superintendents are really honest, but it doesn't matter what I think. We know from research, both in Vermont and nationally, that principals have more sway than a superintendent as far as convincing the public of like what's a good idea and what might not be a good idea. So the first thing we're saying is, hey, it's really important to have principals on board. And one of the things I hear back from a lot of superintendents in Vermont is, hey, Nate, we know this, we've heard this, hey, we've heard it from you, but it's really hard to get our principals on board. They're good people, but they do put their school before their district. And as a result, they're not always supportive of our budgets. They may be supportive in public, but in private, maybe not so much. So we want to talk about today, not just why is it that it's important principals be supportive, but how to get them to be supportive. Because again, the default is some are supportive and some put the needs of their school first and kind of do the eye roll when the budget is presented. So we've talked about why principals have so much influence, but now I want to talk about how do we get them to be supportive? And there are 3 steps that we've seen that really helps earn the principal's support. We should never assume just because they're good team players, they're going to support the budget. Because when we interview principals, including principals in Vermont, they talk about this real dilemma they're in. Like they kind of know that maybe they should drop one section, or maybe they know they should be sharing an art teacher. So they know for the good of the district, some changes might make sense. But they know that for the good of their building, they're afraid they're going to lose a teacher. They're afraid they're going to have to change their schedule. And so they're really being asked, am I loyal to my school? Am I loyal to my district? And that really puts them in a tough situation because they want to be loyal to both. And really smart budgets sometimes don't allow you to do that. And our experience has been that if a principal wasn't involved in developing the budget, if their feedback wasn't taken seriously, and if they didn't have to wrestle with the trade-offs, if they didn't have to do all 3 of those things, they are more likely to lean towards loyalty to their school than loyalty to their district or SU. So let's talk about particularly this idea of nobody really seems to support a plan or a budget that they did not actually help develop. And here's what we see in a lot of places in Vermont and a lot of places across the country. We hear from superintendents and central offices saying our principals were involved in building this budget, therefore they should support it. That's kind of the view from central office. The principals helped build it, and therefore they should help support it. What we hear from principals is we didn't really get to help build it. We really kind of had to say yes to it. And they don't feel the ownership of the budget. They don't feel enough, the principals do not feel enough ownership of the budget to really go out on a limb and support it. So let me share with you what I call the classic way of getting principal involvement, which has not been overly successful. And then we're going to contrast that to a different plan. So here's what we see as a very common way of a central office getting input from their principals around a budget. It starts with the central office drafts the plan. They spend a lot of time, days, weeks, months, figuring out a draft budget, making all the hard decisions. And they do this not because they're mean people either. Like they're making the decisions without the principal at the table because they really respected the principal's time, wanted the principal to be able to stay in the building. So the central office creates the draft budget. Then they have the meeting. And principals know what meeting I'm talking about. It is the meeting in which they share the budget with all the principals. And then either at that meeting or at a follow-up meeting, they say to the principals, so what do you think? Anything you want to change? Give us your feedback. And I think a lot of central offices believe this is a very sincere attempt to get principal input. What we hear from a lot of principals is they feel like so much work has already been done that this budget is pretty much a done deal. And as a result, it's not worth giving a lot of feedback. And so they give a little bit of feedback, but not a lot. Then the central office assumes, whoa, they're pretty comfortable with this budget because they didn't have a lot of feedback. And then they go and present the budget. And then privately, maybe they support it, maybe they don't. They're kind of frustrated, some of the principals. Maybe the implementation's not that good because they were never really on board. This to us is something we see in a lot of districts. We've definitely seen it in some of the districts in Vermont, and we've definitely seen it in other districts across the country. This has the appearance of input, but it does not have the power of principal input. So let's change this a little bit. The first step is before central office drafts a plan, before you put anything on paper, you have a joint brainstorming session with the principals. And you say to the principals, hey, here are the challenges we're facing. What do you think are the options we should consider? What do you think should be on the table? What ideas do you have? But this brainstorming comes before any budget has started to be built. And then the central office can draft the plan. You can then share the plan with the principals for feedback, but you need to create more structured ways of getting honest district-centric feedback. And so I know this seems weird, but I think it is actually, if you're new at this, if your principals haven't had a lot of opportunity to give feedback in the past, you have to go out of your way to convince them that you really want their feedback. That could be actually using anonymous Google surveys if some people aren't completely comfortable. It means giving a chance perhaps to put their ideas, even if it's not anonymous, to put them in writing before the meeting. It means that as a leader, a central office leader, if you say, hey, what do you think? And 4 people in the room have been silent, you actually don't just move on, but you actually ask and require everybody to honestly share what they're thinking. We just want to note that just giving people the chance for feedback, particularly if they're not used to giving honest, candid feedback, sometimes they just don't take the opportunity, but if they don't take the opportunity, you don't get their support. And then really important, after that feedback session, you better go back and revise the plan. If a whole room of people give you feedback and very little changes in the budget, you will never get their feedback again because they're going to feel like you didn't hear from them. And then if you actually do get a plan that reflects the principal feedback, you're much more likely to see that high level of support by principals. This is a process we have seen work wonders. And if you do that, and principals genuinely support your budget, then you can actually ask the principals to be spokespeople. Then you can hope and expect that the principals will support and message their support out in the community. So the role of principals, really important. I think lots of people know that. This process for getting their support, this might be a little different than what some folks are doing today. We also want to make sure that the principals are active spokespeople for the budget. Again, the research from like the Pew Charitable Trust or Gallup polls, all of these research firms say that principals are the best spokespeople. The community trusts principals more than they trust the superintendent. So if you are having a meeting with the school board, if you are having a meeting out in the community to present your budget, having the superintendent and the CFO present the budget is not your best option. Having your principals present the budget or parts of the budget is much more impactful. But if the principal is going to be your spokesperson, it is really important that they feel prepared and that they feel they're going to be successful. So being prepared and successful usually means that the principals want talking points. That they're also going to want to have answers to the frequently asked questions. One of the things we have learned about school leaders is they really value looking smart in front of the community. I think all of us would and all of us do. And part of what makes you, quote, smart in front of the community is when a person asks a question, you can answer it and answer it accurately. Like if every question that's asked of a principal who is your spokesperson has to be answered by the superintendent or the CFO, it doesn't make the principal look or feel like they're the expert in the room, and therefore they're going to be uncomfortable. So what we've done, for example, is have the principal present the budget or their portion of the budget presentation to a friendly audience and see what questions come. So they will then, you can collectively work out the answers in advance. And lastly, if the principals are going to be your spokespeople, and hopefully they can and will be, that central office needs to stand beside them. This is a joint effort. We want to message teamwork. We don't want central office in front, like giving the whole speech and then turning to the principals and saying, hey, do you agree? Because you're kind of just putting them in the position where they have to say yes, but then privately they may or may not. And you don't want to just leave them out there by themselves either, standing behind them. But it's really this kind of joint principal central office. We all built this together. We all stand behind this together. And now we're going to be all presenting it to you together. That is people will trust your delivery, your message much more if it is done with the principals as key spokespeople. So that's the other big benefit of principals being part of this budget process. Now, I want to acknowledge an important point. We're halfway through December. Most of your budgets have already been built. I'm sure all of them have been built. And so you don't have the opportunity, and I know that our timing was not perfect. You don't have the opportunity to go back and go through that whole process I talked about to get principals on board with your budget. Maybe, that train has left the station for now. So two things that I do want you to keep in mind. Certainly when you build your next budget next year, well, we're very early for that. But I also think that if your budget, unfortunately, doesn't get a lot of support from the school board, or if the budget that you present gets a lot of pushback from the community, or if the budget you present doesn't pass when the towns vote, and you have to come up with a revised budget, you have to make changes to your budget anytime going forward this year, I think that is the perfect time to go back to that process I just shared. And let's go back to how we're going to revise this budget. You should have that brainstorming session with the principals. Ask them to help surface the options So I do think for folks who run into any pushback on your budget going forward this year, this process would really help you create the next iteration of your budget. So it's not too late if your budget has to change. I acknowledge it's probably too late if there's smooth sailing for your budget. But if there's smooth sailing, maybe you don't need it as much anyhow this year. So I'd love to get from folks, again, real time, just what steps have any of you taken to empower principals in communicating and supporting the budget? Love to learn from you all. I've had plenty of ideas, but I know you've got some good ideas too. So I will stop talking for a second, and hopefully we can get a few folks on this call. I see we got at least one person jumping in to type, so I appreciate that. Love to know from as many of you, what steps have you taken to empower principals in both developing and communicating the budget, and therefore supporting it, because they are very influential. So we got one more person also entering, which I appreciate. Let's see what we got here. So we spent time at the summer retreat talking about class size and priorities. And we built on those conversations through the budget. Yeah, I really like that. And one thing that I really like about that is that you did it way before you had to build the budget. I always say never go shopping when you're hungry. The worst time to talk about priorities is when you're in the midst of building a budget. So I really like that you did it in the summer. Second thing I'm reading here, those one-on-one conversations with principals, just talking about how to talk about the budget. Also really great strategy. I think the thing I always suggest is, how do you create, when you're having those conversations, how do you create a safe enough environment for a principal to speak honestly? And again, I think that people, superintendents, central office folks, want honest conversation. So I don't want anybody interpreting what I'm saying differently. But I do know, because I've interviewed a lot of principals in my life, they can be really reluctant to say, I know you guys built this budget, but I think it's terrible. Like, I think you're just screwing over my school. I don't think this is fair. They think that, and they say that to maybe their friends or their colleagues. But if they're really thinking that, how do you create an environment in which they would feel comfortable telling you that? Hopefully nicely. So I really appreciate that you're having those conversations. But if you can't create a really safe space, sometimes you're not hearing from them everything you need to hear. And the last one I'm seeing, I ensure my principals have given feedback early on to the central office team, and I encourage their participation at board meetings. When I'm speaking with the board, I need to empower them to speak publicly. Yeah, we've definitely seen, if they will speak publicly, it's very powerful. But here's a really important catch. Principals are generally very good team players publicly. And I had a client, I won't tell you who, in which they asked the principals to support the budget publicly, to get up and speak to the board. And the principals did. They said, this is a tough budget, but it's a realistic budget. We had input on it. This is the right budget for our school and our district. And if you're a superintendent listening to that, you would have gone home that night feeling pretty good. But here's what happened the next day. Is a lot of board members and community members reached out to the principals and said, whoa, I really am surprised you like the budget. And the majority of the principals said, oh, I hate the budget. Like I was just put on the spot and, we all had to, be good team players, but no, I don't think this is a good budget at all. So there's always that downside that if people are being asked to speak publicly and they don't genuinely support it, it is actually worse than having them say nothing at all. And that's why, creating the environment in which it's really safe for people to say what they think so that that their support is genuine. And again, the easiest way to get genuine support is for principals to have had genuine input early in the process. I'm seeing one other person typing, so I'm going to give them a moment or two to finish their thoughts. Take your time. Always interested to learn from. And so here we're seeing that we have one K-8 school and all your high school students are tuitioned out. We have a discussion with the principal in public board sessions, giving team status to the principal to advocate for budget priorities and necessary cuts. Yeah, so clearly in this system, you're having just one principal. They're going to be, and ought to be, and it looks like they are, a very important person at the table in creating the budget, which is great. I do think that when you have 3 or 4 or 5 elementary schools, which I know many of you do, that's where getting all those principals on board matters a whole lot, because in each town, the principal of the school in that town is especially influential. But thanks, folks, for sharing those ideas. I think definitely things to learn from. Let's oops, where is this? Oh, sorry. So if the first idea was let's get principals as champions, and I think many of you are, and hopefully I shared a few ideas to even take that to the next level. The second thing I want to talk about is this importance of letting others wrestle with the trade-offs. And I want to be very specific about this, is that many school systems, the central office, in an effort to shield other people, to shield the principals, to shield the school board, maybe even to shield the community, they take it upon themselves to choose and debate and anguish over what are we going to do more of, what are we going to do less of, what's in the budget, what's out of the budget. These are the very hard budget development discussions. And a lot of the places, the central office wrestles with these hard questions. But the problem with doing that is that you all who wrestled with it know all the pros and cons and have anguished through it, but everybody else got to skip that painful step. But here's what happens. It is human nature that if you give people one unpleasant option, it is really natural for them to say, I don't like it. And then you're in this really weird defensive position where you have to start explaining to them all the things you considered, all the reasons you did this, and why this budget that you have presented is the best of a bunch of perhaps difficult choices. And you are explaining to them the process you went through and the trade-offs you made and the factors you considered. But you're doing all of that right after somebody said, I don't like this. And you're in a defensive position. So what we have found is people say, I don't want this. And yeah, maybe the people who developed the budget, they don't want this budget. It's simply the best budget that you could come up with, given the constraints. But so if you give people just one thing, it is easy for them to say, I don't want this. What we have found, and the research has found, is giving people a few choices and asking them to wrestle with those choices is better. And what ends up happening, imagine if you went to your school board and said, hey, we have 3 ways of creating a thoughtful budget, version A, B, and C. And here's the benefits and drawbacks of each. And they're all come to a total that we can live with. This is not just a budget that are at three different dollar values. It is a budget with different trade-offs. And then the discussion isn't, do you like the budget or not? It is, hey, which one of these three options is better than the other two? And we have found that people really dive into that discussion, that they can actually accept maybe option B, it's better than option A and C, and they can live with it and they'll support it because they realize that, whoa, if we didn't want to change class size at all, we would have to get rid of all of our reading teachers and all of our mental health folks. And I don't want to do that. So maybe we will have to live with slightly larger classes to afford those other things. But you showed them a fully developed budget that didn't touch class size, but had to make up some savings everywhere else. Because what ends up happening is if you had presented that very same budget, but only as one option, let's say this is budget B. This is the budget that when people had three choices actually said was the best budget. If you only gave them this one, I'm willing to bet that a lot of people would say, I don't like it and I don't want it. But then when you gave them three budgets, it might be the very budget that they said, yeah, I can live with it. Now, the only thing I want to caution is I've had a few districts take this approach that I shared, like the three options budget. But what they did is they really wanted option B. So they made option A and C terrible. Like these were options that nobody should want to do. And it was a way of kind of forcing people to pick their favorite choice, option B. I mean, generally put forward three options, all of which are thoughtful, all of which as school and district leaders you could live with. Now, you may all prefer option B, but don't create bad options you really don't want anybody to accept or think anybody will accept, because that really does undermine this whole concept. So this is an example of three budgets that might be going forward to a school board. Obviously, if you have a deadline where the school board must vote on a certain day, the budget, you might want to have done this three options 2 weeks before that deadline so that you have time to come back and maybe make some changes. But when you give people one choice, it is much easier to say, I don't like it. And if you give people two or three choices, you have much more constructive conversation. And this is really working at either you could do this with your principals or you could do this with your school board. There's another way of letting people wrestle with the trade-offs. And this is a tool or a structure that I have used many times. And this is where you give folks a list of very specific options, where you say, hey, here's how we're thinking of, these are all the things we're considering. If we reduced a counselor, that saves us $75,000. If we reduced a reading teacher, if we increase class sizes to 16 kids on average in grades 3 to 5, that saves us $400,000. If we don't make any changes at all, to all the staff comes back and they get their raises from COLA and the contract and they get their health insurance, that's going to incur $300 in excess spending penalties for every household. Or we've heard from a lot of people that you don't like that the superintendent goes out of state. If we ended out of state travel, it actually only saves us $300 because it's mostly covered by a grant. But here is the idea. You are sharing very real, very granular options. And then you say to folks, hey, which ones of these would you pick if we had to save $500,000, if we had to save $250,000? What's really fascinating is when you give people the list, and obviously the list has to be larger than what you're asking them to trim. A couple really interesting things happen. One thing that happens is people realize that there are only uncomfortable decisions to be made. I will tell you that when I did this with a list of 14 very real, it wasn't a game, it was 14 changes we were considering in the school district I ran, and we gave it to all the principals and said, how would you balance the budget? The principals looked at the list and literally said, I'm not making this up. This is way too hard. We're not going to do this. They refused to be the ones who made these really hard decisions. And I said to them, but if you're asking me to make them, then I'm fairly confident you're going to criticize, at least in private, the decisions I was and my team was required to make. So I said, take a week. We're going to come back in a week, and we're going to ask you to balance the budget off of this list. We said during the week, if you have other things you want to put on the list, do. We'll add it. And I will tell you, when they came back the second time, they really disliked having to balance the budget. And they actually chose what they would trim. But when they went to present it, because it really was their list, they went to present it to the board. They said things like, you have no idea how hard this is. We looked for better alternatives and there are none. These are the most thoughtful we could come up with. We wrestled with it, and I'm telling you, this is not a great budget, but it is definitely the best budget possible. And it was so persuasive that a board who I don't think would have supported my budget as a superintendent unanimously supported the budget that had that very earnest principal support because they wrestled with it. Move ahead a year, we had to trim a budget again. We made the list of the 10 or 12 ideas, and the principals and the central office could not actually agree on what ideas. We did not have consensus. And so we did the very strange thing of taking our list and putting it on our district website and created an Excel game in which we asked the public to help balance the budget, saying you had to choose from this list and you had to balance the budget. And we got about 1/3 of the public to actually log on, give us their answers. And we were very surprised at the outcome. They actually supported some changes that we did not think they would. They rejected some changes that we thought they would. And I'm not saying that we can, crowdsource the whole budget process to the community, but their input really helped us. And again, the community came to understand that some of the things they wanted to trim didn't save much money. It was having people wrestle with these difficult decisions. So it's not all just done by a small group of people, really helps people support your decisions because now they appreciate how hard it was. They appreciate that all the options are not great. And they're sharing with you how they would wrestle with the trade-offs. So let other people wrestle with the trade-offs. Very helpful. The last thing I want to talk about in the few minutes we have left, won't need a lot of time, but this idea of when you go out to, quote, win over people, get people to support your budget. That's often the last step of those public meetings we have, the coffees we have to talk about the budget. There's a strategy where we want you to focus on winning over the open-minded, which is not the same as winning over everybody. And here's what I mean by that. And this is from research on how communities make decisions, how community-based votes can be influenced, is if you think about all the people out in the community, and let's say we're talking about the budget, you've got your friends, the people who really support you, who think every decision you've made is a good one. You've got the undecided. These are people who care about the decision, but haven't made up their mind. Their mind is open, but they're learning. But you've also got the uninterested. This is just not their thing. They're not likely to come to a meeting. And then you've got your adversaries. These are the people who really dislike your budget. So you've got these four categories of people. What the research has shown is that many school systems spend a lot of time debating the adversaries. They are trying to confront their misinformation. They are trying to convince them that you had the children's best interests at heart. But a lot of energy goes into debating with the adversaries. But let's be clear, the adversaries hardly ever change their mind. The group that you want to put most of your time with is the undecided. These are people who are interested, their mind is open. So first big idea here is don't get sucked into continually debating your adversaries and not putting enough energy into trying to persuade the undecided. That's thought number one. Thought number two is how do you persuade the undecided? And the research here says what you need to do to persuade the undecided, is to find what are called the unofficial influencers. In every organization, in every community, there are people who have more influence over others. Now, what's really fascinating about unofficial influencers is how unofficial they are. I'll just give you the example that in my district, which was a little bigger than most of the ones in Vermont, but there was one town board member who had a list of about 3,000 people who read her blog every week. What she thought had so much more influence on the undecided than the other town officials combined. We know that some parents who are active in the PTO can be very influential with other parents, but they may not be the president of the PTO. We know that some teachers are deeply connected to the community. And we know some principals have more sway than others. What is really interesting about this is we have worked with school systems, including systems in Vermont, where you get the principals in central office in a room and say, ask them, name the 20 most influential people in your community. Who are the people that other people listen to? And it was really fascinating that it did not take them long to name those 20 most influential people. And it wasn't really by title. Like it wasn't, the town board, the selectmen are all very influential. No, it was one or two of the selectmen were extremely influential. And so what you can do is if you can name the 20 most influential people, the people who the undecided will listen to, what you want to do then as a school, as a superintendent, as a team of superintendent and principals, because remember these influencers also trust principals, is you really do want to have one-on-one meetings with those 20 influential people. You want to share your budget, share your thinking, let them ask a lot of questions, answer their questions honestly. And if you can win over 20 highly influential people, you will win over many, many hundreds of undecided people. So that's the last big strategy here is if we're going to focus on the undecided, best way to get there is through roughly 10 to 25 highly influential people. And you're going to get their support by meeting with them individually, sharing your thinking, answering their questions. So that is a relatively quick walkthrough of strategies we've seen to build support for those budgets you've already built. Hopefully that is helpful. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And just to remind folks, we've got a really great session coming later this afternoon to talk about a budget presentation PowerPoint template we've built and the thinking behind what makes for a great presentation.